You just got pranked, bro!
Hello everyone. I know that many of you thought that I was dead, but it turns out that I'm just really lazy and bad at managing my time. Who knew? Now, before we get this whole shindig started, I should probably explain what happened and why my first attempt at this series kind of got, what's the phrase, Kurt Cobained? As I was recording the second episode of this series, a few technical issues began to appear. First off, my FPS tanked out of nowhere, and I have no idea why. Before anyone calls me a bitch for complaining about low FPS, I used to be like you. I really did. I used to not care about the difference between 30 and 60 frames per second. However, as I've grown older and more knowledgeable, I still don't actually give a shit. The difference between the two doesn't impact my gameplay at all. You know what does impact my gameplay? When STARBOUND runs at 8 FPS. Then I start to notice. Now, the second and arguably more egregious issue is that my save file got corrupted. For some reason, the game just shat the bed. It would crash as soon as I loaded the save file.
Yo, check this out. Look at this. Absolutely no way I'm getting through that. Completely solid. But watch this.
I also have no idea how or why this happened, but I have minor confidence that the issue won't happen again because I trimmed a lot of my mods. Very minor confidence. That mod list will be available in the description, by the way, in case anyone was interested. So, after my save file got corrupted, I was just kind of stuck. I was kind of bummed about all that effort going to waste in the first playthrough. I decided to give myself a few weeks to see how I felt. And here we are 8 months later. Listen, Diablo 4 came out and I had to play that. I also wanted 100% Monster Hunter Rise, which is not an easy feat. And I may or may not have also 100%ed Craftopia's Seamless World update. And also Stardew Valley, sue me. Anywho, let's go ahead and jump right in and get this playthrough started for the second time. Now, I'm not Keanu Reeves, and as much as I wish I were, I make a lot of mistakes, and I made plenty of them on my first playthrough. However, now that we have the opportunity to make a new character, it's a perfect opportunity to fix those mistakes. My first mistake was my playstyle. Melee is kinda boring in FRACKIN Universe, contrary to my first impressions, and with FRACKIN Universe making melee swings cost a bit of stamina to use, there really wasn't any purpose in sticking to melee weapons and being inflexible. I might as well try out guns if we're doing this whole shtick again from the start. So that's my first change. I'm not playing a knight in the RPG growth mod because I'm not going to focus on melee weapons. So what are our options? Wizard only really had one interesting specialization that stood out to me, the Necromancer. I actually did want to try this class out, so I made a test character off camera, and yeah, that is not a fucking Necromancer. So Wizard is off the table. There was also the Ninja and Rogue, but Ninjas and Rogues are basically the same thing, just ask Final Fantasy XIV. Plus, I didn't really want to run around like Naruto, so they're both out. That left Soldier and Explorer. Now, Soldier actually had some fun playstyle options. However, and this might surprise you given that I just said that I wanted to focus on guns, but I don't think I want to go with Soldier. The Explorer is a class that might not seem that amazing of a choice on paper, but in FRACKIN Universe, they have some serious potential with their specializations. The captain buffed nearby allies, yada yada yada, that's not what I'm talking about. What if I told you that Explorer had a specialization that was so underlooked, so underappreciated, that it would surprise you that I was even considering becoming one? Introducing the Pioneer. This bad boy on paper seems kinda weak, but good things come in small packages, ladies. Not only does this guy get the ability to place flags that can be teleported to later, but they also get a special one-handed tool called the Nautilus that, when activated, grants them a bubble shield. Now, this is no ordinary bubble. It grants the Pioneer free movement in liquid, but even better, it makes the Pioneer immune to all environmental effects, including lava, poison, and even radiation. It also makes the player immune to fall damage. Compared to the ability to summon drones or buff allies, it might not seem that powerful, but, and hear me out on this, what if it applied to all of the new status effects in FRACKIN Universe? That would make the Pioneer busted as shit. And spoiler alert, I tested it, it does fucking apply to FRACKIN Universe's new environmental statuses, and it's really fucking good. And finally, it's worth mentioning that every base class gets a special weapon specific to their class. Knights get a cool two-handed sword that can be used as a shield, which is pretty cool. However, Explorers get something really interesting. It's a one-handed drill weapon that can mine blocks and deal damage to enemies. Not only is that kinda useful, but it's also a reference to Gurren Lagann, one of the best anime series to ever exist, #biased. Anyway, the Explorer is going to be our obvious choice. I mean, come on, anime references and environmental immunity? It was going to be a no-brainer, guys. Now to pick a race. I was originally going to play Montesi again, but I felt that I should kinda swap things up and try to play something different. We had some options here. The Nova Kid had some pretty good gun bonuses. The Glitch had good defensive bonuses. Yeah, I don't think anyone gives a fuck about my process about picking a race. I pick Slime. It gets constant regeneration as long as it's not hungry, it only takes half fall damage, and it's immune to the Slime, Web, and Poison status effects. The biggest weakness that a Slime has is that it loses a significant chunk of its max HP whenever it's in a cold biome. That basically meant that we needed to be careful around cold planets, big whoop. I'll either avoid them or come incredibly prepared with a Gundam mech-style suit and some flamethrowers in order to create some global warming. In my opinion, for how much you get in raw bonuses for playing Slime, the weaknesses can be compensated for pretty easily, hence why I chose Slime. Plus, Slime races are just a cool concept in general, especially in sci-fi settings. Anyway, I gave my Slime Boy a very alien-sounding name,
Snuppet,
and got to actually playing the game for once. The first part of the game was the same as last time. Wake up on your busted-ass ship, beam down to the starter planet, find the mobile lab, go through the cave, kill the mother monster, and finally get to the Ark. One thing I'm going to point out here, I'm not going to be focusing on the main questline this time. This is one of the mistakes I made on my last character. I was so concerned with progressing and getting all the boring vanilla shit out of the way that I completely neglected a lot of the FRACKIN universe content. At this point, the universe was our oyster. In order to get our bearings, the most important thing that we could have was a base of operations.
Yeah, boy.
And no, I was not going to use our ship. We all know how I feel about that. I wanted to do something different rather than just make a space station as our base, and I wanted to scout Tabula Rasa planets, maybe set something up there, and then I thought to myself, why? The only inherent bonus that you get by using a planet is the research points. That wasn't a small bonus, mind you, but space stations are just so fucking useful, and cool, and customizable. I see no reason why I would ever bother using a Tabula Rasa planet when I could just use a space station. Now, for anyone who's bummed out about this, I will compromise and tell you to trust me. I want you to know that I have plans for a permanent base of operations later in the series that involves some really heavy terraforming. Trust me, even some of you are going to be going, what the fuck, and why would you possibly ever want to do that? It's going to be good, I promise. Just wait for the next episode. For now, a space station would do the trick for a base just fine, so we spent the next hour or two looting anything that wasn't nailed down in NPC villages, and running challenge rooms for that fat loot. In no time at all, we had our transponder. Before we could even bother deploying our space station, we needed to handle our FTL drive situation. This required doing the instanced story mission in the Arceus mining facility, as well as collecting some materials. Done and done. Now we just needed to find a solar system with a funny or cool name and set up our station. I found the very ominous, but somehow also very funny solar system named Deep Tyson. Deep Tyson. And we deployed our station. I spent the next couple minutes upgrading the crafting benches and expanding the space station, and then doing the first chunk of the main storyline in order to unlock our class weapon, the Spira. Speaking of, and I think I said this earlier, but I was really excited for this thing. It was both a weapon and a mining tool, referencing an anime that I love. This thing was going to be amazing. And then I actually got my hands on it, and it fucking sucked. Don't get me wrong, it mines really fast. Almost too fast, honestly. But that speed came with a lot of downsides. First off, it eats through your energy tremendously fast. That alone wouldn't have been so bad, but it also kinda sucked as a weapon, dealing very meager damage to the enemies that I was encountering underground. And lastly, worst of all, this weapon had a major flaw. It's a gun.
A gun with one bullet. Mortis.
Like a literal gun. It wasn't a hand drill or anything. This thing's sprite was actually so long that I actually thought that it was a two-handed rifle when I first saw it. I can't imagine trying to hold this thing with one hand in real life. It definitely would be giving me carpal tunnel on par with all the Dark Souls characters using a strength weapon in one hand. Anyway, and I mentioned this before, but guns in Starbound have an inherent problem in that projectiles literally spawn in the world with a velocity at the barrel of your gun. This means that anything between your body and the barrel of your gun won't be hit by your bullets. Which is the worst problem for this weapon because the Spira literally creates a drill sprite at the barrel of the gun, and blocks that touch the sprite will take damage and eventually break. This mechanic is similar to how the mech drills work, except for this guy, it isn't spaced correctly like the mech drills are, which results in this insanely massive dead space. This blind spot between the character and the barrel of the gun where nothing gets mined, and this is a problem in most situations because you can't effectively use it to fucking mine blocks. It just doesn't work. It performs decently well underwater or in space with no gravity, but that isn't a common enough occurrence to warrant you carrying this thing around you at all times. Needless to say, I am not a fan of the Spira. It's an okay mining tool in the early game, I guess, but it gets heavily outclassed by even the mining lasers. Which leads me to my next point, the mining lasers. Holy shit, was I sleeping on these things. I complained about them last video tanking my FPS, and while they still do, they're also really good at mining. Obviously they'd fall off once I had some matter manipulator upgrades, just like the Spira, but for the time being, they perform pretty well even though I've only upgraded them a couple of times. The last thing to bring attention to was something that some of you might have even noticed in the footage so far. Apparently, the Explorer class in the RPG Growth mod gets an interesting passive ability that gives them a glow effect as long as their health is above 50%. Now, we're a slime, so our health is pretty much always above the 50% threshold, but more importantly, when I say this gives your character a glow, you might think that it's barely negligible, sort of like the Nightar's Racial Night Vision perk. No, the glow is actually fairly strong. You basically don't even need to bother with torches or a flashlight when you're in caves or outside at night, which was pretty nifty actually. Now, I'm not saying that I'm as radiant as the noonday sun, that I never need to carry around light sources or anything. I'm just saying that this is a pretty massive bonus for the early game before you get your hands on sources of the glow effect. Then I finally upgraded my armor and weapons, opting to go for the Researcher's set once again, like I did on my last character. This set just provided some insane bonuses that were hard to pass up at this stage of the game. Infinite oxygen, a headlight, and a +1 research point bonus, among other things. Another thing that I wanted to try out, because why not, is the item network system, allowing you access to a pretty powerful storage system, awfully reminiscent of Minecraft's Applied Energistics, or, if you're familiar with it, the Magic Storage mod for Terraria. Basically, it allows you to link up multiple chests with a network terminal in which you can store and search for items all in one place, saving you the hassle of having to dig through an entire warehouse full of storage containers. Very useful, especially for pack rats like myself. I read through some of the wiki articles on the subject, and it didn't seem that complicated, so I got started by making a handful of ship lockers and expanding their storage using the enhanced storage mod. I gutted the starter room on the space station and tested out configurations until I settled on 6 wall-mounted lockers, and it works pretty well. After playing around with the item network terminal, the only feature that it was missing was a way to input items back into the containers. I realized that this wasn't really technically possible, and that I was going to need a dump chest, a container that I could just drop items into and have the items routed back into each individual container for the network. I studied the wiki page for the item transference devices, which are very useful items that I would be using later to automate machines, but for now we were just going to use them to sort items out of the dump chest. This took a lot longer than I would care to admit, particularly because I needed to actually get multiple item transference devices. And because each item transference device needs a teleporter core, which needs diamonds, I had to go mining multiple times. I could always research how to build my own teleporter cores, and I would eventually, but I wanted to stock up on resources anyway, so it was sort of a 2 bird 1 stone kind of situation. The reason I needed multiple ITDs is a little gimmicky. Due to how the item network was coded, there's no real way to configure an ITD to output to multiple chests, with each chest getting one category of item. This meant that each container in the storage network was going to need its own ITD off of the dump chest, unfortunately. I was only using 3 of these containers at the time, so I needed 3 ITDs. Wow, that was a very long explanation for what should have been a very simple system. Kinda makes me appreciate games and mods that implement this kind of thing seamlessly. However, the end result was actually pretty nifty. While it might have been a lot more complicated to set up than I first thought, it was really cool to just pull items from the terminal, craft whatever I wanted, and then dump all the items that I didn't need back into the dump chest and just let the system do its thing. And I was pretty happy with the end result. Mostly. After creating this item network system, I very quickly noticed that my space station base was running at a very low FPS for some reason. I thought it might have been the ITD and the item network in general, so I raised the interval for the 3-state configurer, but that still didn't help. I ended up spending half an hour upgrading many of the crafting stations as possible so I could stick them in this Omni Crafter, which is a very neat mod by the way. Some of you might have been wondering what this thing is as I walk past it. It's a mod that gives you this guy, and you can let him scan crafting stations in your hand so that you can access them all in one place. It's a little finicky, but once you get it working, it saves you a ton on space and a lot of having to walk around between crafting stations. And yet I was still having FPS problems, even after consolidating my base. So I did a bit more research and eventually wound up going into these STARBOUND configuration files and turning off the VSync. And this fixed the problem tremendously. I have no idea why STARBOUND has VSync turned on by default, but you know, whatever.
'Cause fuck them, that's why.
The last thing I wanted to do before we moved on to new stuff was build my ship out. Unlike last time, I didn't want anything too extravagant or fancy. I wanted to build something that actually resembled a ship instead of the insane Emperor's Children style thing that I made on my last character. When it came to actually building our ship, I needed a set of blocks to use for construction. Unlike my last character's ship, I couldn't just buy all the Montesi blocks and use them as a base set. I wanted something a little more modern, a little more sleek. I mentioned earlier that I had a test character before my last playthrough. On this test character, I built my entire spaceship using the Nightar themed blocks that are purchasable from a vendor at the Science Outpost. The block set is interesting. It's very dark. Sporting mostly midnight black blocks with this bright cyan accent, the set looks cool, but I didn't want anything pitch black from the set. Listen, I'm all for the edgy theme, and I did love the ship on my test character. I actually do quite like the Nightar aesthetic. It's sort of a cyberpunk vampire knight theme. It's cool, it's just not what I wanted to run on this character. After getting a few ideas for myself, I built a ship component racializer, which allows you to convert your default ship components into other races' ship components. I spent a ton of research points delving into the craftsmanship tree, where I realized just how many blocks and decorative items that Frackin universe adds to the game. I knew it was a lot, but holy shit is this mod deep. Anyway, I spent a while testing out different blocks until I finally had a set that I was happy with. It was a nice silver and black aesthetic with sort of like pale blue accents. Similar to the Nightar block set, but not as edgy. More sleek and modern rather than dark and vampiric. I also built a ship component assembler, which is honestly where the build your own ship system really starts to shine through in the Frackin universe mod. This crafting bench, after you research it, gives you access to hundreds of decorative objects from almost any race's set. If you encounter another race's ship out in space as you're traveling around, this is where you can build those parts for your ship. Glitch turrets and castle crenellations, Hylodal ship fans, Montesi marble statues, Novakid exterior train parts, all of that stuff is here, along with tons of other decorations that you'd see on ships throughout the game. This is what allows you to make your ship not just a floating series of square rooms with a handful of boosters strapped on the back. After playing around with the die tool on my matter manipulator, I felt confident that I had a decent game plan and got started designing something in Paint.net. Now, in my head I knew that I wanted something at least slightly resembling an actual spacecraft, while also retaining all the technical features I wanted, like a crew space, an engine room, and an airlock room. If you don't know what purpose an airlock serves on our ship, I go into great detail in the previous video about how and why I do this. I'm not really going to explain it here for the sake of time. Once I had a decent design that I was happy with, I spent some time crafting and gathering a stack of all the block types that we would need for the in-game construction, and rush getting some money and go ahead and get that ball rolling, but there was actually one more thing I wanted to tackle before we handled our money problem. I was severely overdue for a mining upgrade. The mining lasers were good and all, but we were at a stage where I was getting pretty tired of my FPS being shit whenever I had to go out and go mining. I mean, come on, all this progress and we still haven't gotten our hands on Morphite yet? It was high time to get a Morphite manipulator in our hands. Morphite itself is a pretty useful material, but it required a few esoteric components. Luckily, FRACKIN Universe doesn't expect you to farm phase matter from ghost enemies, and actually gives you a method to turn thorium and telebrium into phase matter. Probably for this exact reason, actually, making Morphite. Now that we had some Morphite, we needed the actual tool research. We were a bit lacking in research points at this stage, so we had to wait a few minutes, but eventually we got it unlocked. Now to craft the manipulator. God fucking damn it, ferrosium? That's not even in our tier. What the fuck? AI chips and their stuff were pretty easy, but this shit? Whatever. All I needed to do was find a tier 5 planet that had some ferrosium on it. We were desperately low on research points anyway, and we would need about 15,000 in order to complete all the research on AI chips and unstable particles and all that other fun stuff, so it was a good idea to kill some time. I found a very hospitable and not at all bone-chilling Arctic planet that had some ferrosium on it, and I got to mining. I explored the planet, finding that I was actually perfectly fine hanging out on it, and I spent a while just mining stuff and clearing ancient challenge rooms and all that fun stuff before we finally had enough research banked up that I could get what I wanted. I researched quantum processors, and then AI chips, and then I crafted all the components that I needed to finally get my Morphite manipulator. It is a massive upgrade, and I was very happy that I could finally toss the mining lasers into some random container where they belong, forever. Question 1. Should we upgrade this thing with manipulator modules? I eventually opted not to. I didn't know how far off the quantum manipulator was, and this thing was already really damn good as it is, so I didn't want to waste the manipulator modules if I didn't have to. Question 2. Upgrade our armor. That's not a question, but I did it anyway. I wanted an armor set that made me immune to pressure conditions, just in case I decided to visit a gas giant, so I built a set of Valkyrie armor. I wasn't a fan of how it looked, so I also decided to build a full set of Kingslayer armor and a flex cape for cosmetic purposes. I think we actually looked pretty nifty, like a Fortnite character. Anyway, now we breach upon the sacrosanct topic of money. Everyone wants it, just ask Pokimane. It was high time to make our fortune, and we were not going to be selling cookies to get it.
Like, if you're a broke boy, just say so.
I needed an excessive amount of money for the crew members that I wanted eventually, plus there were a lot of interesting items that I wanted at the science outpost, like the capture guns. All of these things needed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pixels in the long run. Now, some of you might remember that on my last character, I used the colony management system to create a prison, apartment complex, in which I could charge my tenants rent and spy on them, secure them against outside harm. I also may or may not have also collected their piss and shit in order to fertilize my growing trays. However, I didn't want to focus on the colony system this time. I suspect that it was a fairly decent source of the FPS drops that I was experiencing on my last character, and I also really just wanted to try out something different to make money. I had a couple of options here. Bees were a great investment because apparently if you go far enough into breeding them, you can have bees that create diamonds for you, which sounded awesome.
Bees ought to put a stop to that. The situation has only been made worse with the addition of yet more bees.
However, another option was powered automation setup. At first glance, it might seem like even basic automation is locked behind extensive research, but that isn't actually the case. You can start rudimentary automation as early as you want to, though I will say that the starter machines and generators are pretty fucking terrible, so you should probably wait until you unlock titanium at least. Now, there's no way to mine things infinitely in STARBOUND, or maybe there is in some broken as shit mod in the workshop, but we weren't going to be going that route. And while FU does have quarries, they don't dig infinitely, and their range is, well, it's not good. So quarries were not going to be very useful to us, at least for now. No, instead of actually mining our resources, we were going to be taking advantage of the most moist matter in the universe. Liquids.
Liquid!
Before we get into factory automation, I need to explain liquids. You see, FU has a couple of methods to acquire liquid in infinite quantities. 1. Find a planet that housed an ocean of a particular fluid and just grab some of that sweet liquid for yourself. Or 2. Use the liquid mixer, which allows it to cocktail 1 unit of 2 liquids in order to create 2 units of one of the liquids. This sounds complicated, but all this machine really does is mimic the effect of dropping special liquids into the environment, and letting them convert another fluid into more of itself. Some players might not know this, but this mechanic is actually present in vanilla STARBOUND. One example of this is healing water and water. If you drop a single block of healing water onto a pond of normal water, the healing water converts the entire pond into more of itself. Now, the liquid mixer was very useful, and we were definitely going to be exploiting it later for ourselves, but did we need it right now? Theoretically speaking, all we really had to do was find an infinite ocean of something useful and extract resources from that liquid, earning our fortune by processing and then selling those resources. This was easier said than done, and to go any further, I also need to explain something else: strange sea planets. Strange sea planets in modern day FU are planets whose top layer is a big ocean of plasmic fluid. Now, plasmic fluid in real life is, it's pretty gross. It's that yellow stuff that comes out of blood when you spin it in a centrifuge, but I digress. Plasmic fluid in FRACKIN universe is very useful. However, in the old days of FU, strange sea planets were a lot more interesting. They could roll infinite oceans of almost any fluid in the game. An ocean of coconut milk, or mercury, or even liquid iron. Now, the devs removed the random liquids for balance reasons. I'm not really going to sit here and make a video essay on why I think game developers need to let people in a primarily single-player game have their fun and stop nerfing shit, but needless to say, this was a dumb decision. So I reversed that dumb decision. I found a mod that reverted the change, so now strange sea planets are completely random, and that means that if we get lucky and find a strange sea planet with something really useful on it, and then simply extracted something valuable from the liquid, we would have a pretty decent passive income. In fact, part of the endgame FU for a lot of players is automating incredibly difficult and intricate recipes for technologically advanced items like quantum batteries or whatever.
Is it the quantum carburetor or something? Quantum carburetor? Jesus, Morty, you can't just add a sci-fi word to a car word and hope it means something.
Resulting in wiring setups that look like Cthulhu's pubic hair. Now, I know what some of you are going to say.
My immersion. How about you immerse yourself in a shower, bro?
You might just think that strange sea planets are gold mines and are super easy to exploit, but I'd like to tell you why you're wrong. You see, this mod doesn't just revert the strange sea planets back to having a random liquid. It also reverts them back to having the unknown type, which means that these fuckers can roll almost anything. The first one I landed on had an ocean of mercury, which is already scuffed because, you can't swim in mercury. It's so dense that even lead floats on its surface. Don't ask me how the player is even able to swim through it, but that's not the point. This planet was so dangerous that I would have been dead in seconds if I wasn't using the Pioneer specialization from the RPG Growth mod and had access to the Nautilus tool. This planet had a mildly poisonous atmosphere, extreme cold, mild heat somehow at the same time, unbreachable darkness making me blind as shit, severe poisonous gas in the air, and plasmic disruption. This planet also had tar raining from the sky, along with spawning a lot of different ores, including plasmic crystals, normal crystals, cinnabar, because why not, there obviously wasn't enough fucking mercury here, noxium, prism shards, telebrium, and even ephigium, which is why ghosts can spawn here. Needless to say, this planet was absolutely cursed, and this was just the first strange sea planet that I landed on. God knows what the other ones even look like. This is why the mod isn't broken. This is why these planets are fun. Because they're absolute fucking chaos, but they reward the player if they can somehow survive here with an infinite resource. I kept looking for strange sea planets, finding all sorts of nifty oceans. During my search, I came across a strange sea planet that had a precursor biome on it, apparently. I'd never seen any of these before, but I knew that the endgame in FRACKIN universe involved the precursors in some way, so I aggressively searched the planet until I finally found it. Unfortunately, this strange sea planet also had the unbreachable darkness status effect on it, and I hadn't gotten around to making a darkness shield augment yet, so we were stuck bumbling around in the dark looking for cool shit. I'm gonna be honest with you, my heart was kind of racing at this point, so I wasn't really paying attention to what I was looting. I just knew that I wanted anything that wasn't nailed down. After both of my crewmates ended up dying and being stuck in this place alone, I eventually found a boss of some kind. At least it had a big HP bar on the bottom of my screen, so I assumed that it was a boss. Unfortunately for it, I had a weapon that was able to shoot through walls, so it didn't really stand a chance. After looking around at the room that the boss was present in, I looted some kind of device off the walls and then found this room encased in dead core blocks, the hardest to mine block in the entire FU mod. These guys took minutes to mine with an unupgraded matter manipulator, so I was really happy that I decided to upgrade to the morphite manipulator before stumbling across this thing. After breaching the room, the device in the center appeared to be some kind of cosmic anvil upgrade station thing. I didn't really have much in the way of ancient essence at this point, so I decided to just call it quits and slap in a teleporter so that I could access this thing later if I wanted. After returning home to my space station, I sifted through everything that I had grabbed. Most of it was decorative or otherwise useless, but it did have two interesting devices: an Arceus converter and a precursor fabricator. Again, this is all new to me, so I had no idea what the hell any of this stuff did. The fabricator appeared to be some sort of pixel printer, I guess, allowing me to create objects using pixels. It was cool, but it also tanked my game's FPS every few seconds while I had the crafting menu open, so I didn't really test it out. The Arceus converter, on the other hand, was very fascinating. The tooltip said that it converted Arceus fuel into more potent fuel, so I immediately got into my ship and headed to a moon in order to mine a bunch of Arceus. After sticking it into the converter, I got this weird subspace fluid. It's not a fuel, it doesn't have a fuel value. So I was kinda doubting the usefulness of this converter thing when I decided to just start sticking random shit into it. I grabbed some Arceus crystals and stuck them in and got something called a state phase gel. I also had no idea what any of this stuff did, but I assumed that this was all going to be useful later. I kept sticking stuff in, pure Arceus crystals, moon dust, moon rock, but none of that was working. Then I started using other fuels. The converter might say that it only accepts Arceus type fuel, but what's to say that it couldn't use something like uranium? I grabbed some rods and stuck them in, and that's when my day went from good to great. We got something called quantum fluid as an output, and this thing was an actual fuel type. So this converter did work, just not in the way that I thought it did. I started sticking every fuel that I could into this thing: plutonium, thorium, and even unrefined fuel. It appears as though this thing could accept a certain amount of each radioactive rod and convert it into 1 unit of quantum fluid. This technically wasn't cost efficient because the fluid was only worth 200 fuel units, whereas 25 plutonium or uranium rods were actually worth a lot more than that. But I came across an interesting discovery. This thing accepts liquid irradium because it's technically a fuel source. More specifically, it takes 80 liquid irradium and gives 1 quantum fluid in return. Not only is that a very cost-efficient trade, effectively increasing our fuel output from 160 to 200, a 25% increase in efficiency, but the liquid irradium was also really easy to get. I had already found an infinite ocean of it at the core of one of the planets that I had explored. So we effectively had an infinite source of this stuff, which meant that we had an infinite source of quantum fluid. I spent the next half hour or so grinding an ungodly amount of liquid irradium and then used an item transference device to automate the input and output of the converter. Now that we had an automated process, I just needed to fill this container up with liquid irradium every so often, and we now had an infinite fuel source.
Please, as if you could handle even a fraction of my power.
While I was hanging out on my base, I decided to make the Darkness Shield, an augment that prevents you from being blinded on certain planets. This required a few weird things like researching honed Lunari crystals and finding some Darklight blossoms, which apparently only grew on chromatic planets, so I had to go hunt some down on my own. The honed Lunari was interesting because it needed quantum fluid. This converter is already paying dividends, isn't it? Now we're immune to being blinded. Hooray! Back to the precursor biome that I had found, now that I had the Darkness Shield and I could see properly. I sifted around the ruins, finding a few containers with codexes, and these little things called data boxes, which were apparently a high-level computer. At some point, both of my crew members died and left me alone. Again. Kinda starting to wonder how useful these guys can be outside of just eating bullets for me, but whatever. I stumbled across a room that I'd never seen before. I flipped a switch on the wall and the upper section opened up, giving me access to a room with some kind of teleporter, along with another Arceus converter. Score! This would essentially double my output of quantum fluid once I got back to the base and hooked it up, but this teleporter was far more interesting to me. I went back to the base, dropped off all my stuff, and set up the new converter into the automated system, and then I revived my crew members and went back to the teleporter. I didn't know what I was going to expect on the other side. I fought some bats in a cave, and then came across actual precursor ruins. How fun! I'd love to loot everything that isn't nailed down, but unfortunately this is one of those instanced missions that FRACKIN universe loves so much, and everything is protected by a barrier and can't be mined. I found a chest with a data chip of some kind, talking about coordinates and the science outpost. That sounds ominous. I then continued into the dungeon. I'm not a big fan of the sphere puzzle stuff. I didn't like it in the previous instances, and I really didn't like it here. I went one way into the dungeon and then found myself faced with tunnels that were too small for my regular sphere tech, which meant that I was going to need to find a microsphere tech to keep going. I was legitimately considering just warping out, but then I decided to try to find an alternate path before I quit. Luckily, I found another path that contained a chest with an infinite beer brewing backpack, that sounds useful, which leads to a room with a pedestal. Upon interacting with the pedestal, I was granted the precursor microsphere tech. Now, I was genuinely concerned that I was going to have to come back with the higher level tech that I was going to have to research, so I was very happy that I didn't have to leave. However, what you just witnessed is one of the few weak points in FRACKIN Universe's instanced content. Am I actually stuck? Do I really need to leave and come back with more stuff, or is the dungeon going to provide the tools to progress if I explore further? Sometimes the dungeon doesn't give you what you need, particularly around explosives. Numerous doors in these dungeons requires bombs to crack open, and if you didn't bring any, you're fucked. Other times, the dungeon actually does give you special tools to keep going, like the precursor microsphere tech. Anyway, we kept going, encountering some precursor enemies and looting as much as we could. A bunch of times throughout the dungeon we encountered the exact same situation, where the end of the path resulted in a switch or a button that I pushed, and then I was given no inclination what that button did. I would have to backtrack and figure out where I needed to go next. I'm not saying that dungeons need to be linear. I love Zelda games for being labyrinthine, but it doesn't really work in STARBOUND. This is not the game that you should be forcing players to backtrack like this, and this dungeon was especially egregious. It's one thing to force the players to backtrack once or twice. It's another thing when every single path leads to a dead end where you just flip a switch and then you have to walk backwards until you figure out what changed. It's not fun, and I don't know why the FRACKIN devs designed it like this. And I should probably talk about the second issue I have with the FU dungeons. They're massive, and they hurt my PC to even load sometimes. I wasn't seeing these issues at the beginning of the dungeon, but about 10 minutes in, my game was grinding to a halt sometimes, bringing me down to 10 FPS or even lower. None of my PC resources were being maxed out, so this was just STARBOUND being unoptimized and the FRACKIN Universe devs trying to kill my PC by loading in a massive dungeon complex. They seriously need to fucking dial it back when it comes to the sheer size of some of these instance dungeons. I thought the goddamn Verdant Ruins were bad, but this shit is somehow worse, and it completely kills the vibe of exploring a new place when a PC starts chugging every 5 seconds. After about half an hour of meandering around the empty precursor complex and feeling like Patrick Bateman listening to his music, I finally found the boss room. I very excitedly entered the boss room, and then I died in seconds. The entire rest of the dungeon gave me zero trouble when it came to combat, but suddenly this warbot or whatever, along with his handful of ads, nearly killed me instantly. If I was playing a hardcore character, I would have been fucking pissed. You should never struggle with a boss when the enemies along the way to the boss were easy. You especially should never die to a boss fight confused about what killed you with no idea about how to avoid dying next time. It feels like bad game design, and it probably means that the boss was overtuned. It's not like we were walking around naked. I'm wearing tier 4 armor. Whatever. We respawn at the start of the ruins and we have to walk all the way back. Hooray! Luckily, this time the boss was far easier, and once all of his ads were killed, it was very simple to just use my Magnorbs to stunlock his ass in the corner of the room until he finally died. None of the loot was especially noteworthy except for the pistols, which kinda made me mad, but at least we were done with the dungeon. I know for a fact that I definitely missed some shit, and I would return eventually after I unloaded all my stuff and took a break because that was an ordeal and not a fun one. Though, I will admit that the infinite beer was definitely something worth going through all that hassle for. You can apparently stick beer into growing trays as fertilizer even though that literally doesn't make any sense.
Please, my children, feast upon my ass juice beer.
On that note, I think this was a good wrapping up point for the episode. It might sound like I'm jaded, but I'm actually having fun playing this, for the most part. I'm also really ecstatic that my save hasn't been corrupted yet. So thanks for watching, everyone. The next episode will not take 7 months to make, I promise. It should be out within the next few weeks.